Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. Today we'll be discussing the evolution of digital payments in India with Monica Jasuja and Ritu Bhandari. Monica is a senior executive with 2 decades of experience in building innovative digital products for the financial services industry. She's passionate about creating solutions in the digital payment space. She's worked in several key markets such as the US, Taiwan, Singapore, which gives her a fairly unique perspective in terms of how digital financial solutions work. Hi, Monica. Welcome once again to Bharat Varta. How are you doing?
Doing very well, thank you, and had a good lunchtime with Bharat Varta. So wonderful to be back.
Great. We also have Ritu Bhandari, who is making her debut today. Ritu is head of research at Smahi Foundation of Policy and Research. She's a chartered accountant with extensive experience having worked in the banking industry. She's based out of Mumbai. She has co-authored a research report titled Digital Payments in India and Atmanirbhar India Pioneering and Leading the Digital Revolution. A report we'll be referring extensively in this podcast. So thanks for joining us, Ritu. How are you doing?
Thanks, Srivatsa, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be on this show. I have always watched Bharat Varta shows and found them very interesting and informative. Hi, Monica.
Hi.
Great.
And welcome.
Thank you.
So to start off, I would like to get both of your perspective on this. So maybe we'll start with you, Monica. So in terms of the overall digitization of the payment landscape today in India, where exactly are we?
So we're miles ahead, and this is one question I get asked often. We are miles ahead of a lot of countries, but at the same time, I don't think we've made a lot of progress on the main competitor that we have, which is actually cash. The reason I keep saying this is that while we keep making strides and huge amount of noise in terms of and headlines also for the right reasons, in terms of being able to manage to make UPI a 2 billion a month transaction platform, in order to be able to have the Jam Trinity, to be able to do dispersals, which happened during COVID. And there was dispersals worth, I don't know how many thousands of crores that went pretty much unreported in the international media. The question really becomes, has India made enough strides to say that we would have less reliance on cash as a GDP, as percentage of our GDP, which is what we are fighting? The answer would be probably no. Are we going in the right direction? And the answer is definitely yes. So therefore, when we consider ourselves and force ourselves to benchmark against emerging economies or even developed nations, there are a lot of things where India ticks all the right boxes in terms of having the infrastructure in place and also the right amount of push, whether it comes to UPI, whether it comes to a digital framework such as Ocean, the Jam Trinity, the India Stack, and also the account aggregator framework. But I would say that the private partnerships and the private sector is essentially playing the major role of disruptor along with the Indian government, which we are probably not paying a lot of attention to, because, it's one of those things, it's one of those hidden stories that we tend to think about layering it with UPI success or other success. It's the small things that are happening in the background which are creating huge fintech superstars. At the same time, big tech is not only finding its feet in India, it's actually growing within fintech and payments, which means that digital transactions and digital payments are only meant to grow. So therefore, a long answer to a very oft repeated question. And while I'm happy with the pace of what is happening, I'm sure Ritu is going to spread a lot more light on what we are seeing in terms of actual numbers. I'm enthusiastic, but I think we have a very far way to go still.
Ritu, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. I totally agree with you there. If you look at the payment systems, India has one of the most progressive payment system in the world, thanks to NPCI and the foundational public infrastructure India Stack, which is real-time, cost-effective, and highly scalable. Importantly, India's payment landscape is robust. There are multiple independent payment players and multiple modes of payment. However, we have only 100 million digital users, and we need to add 5x more, which would take a lot of concerted efforts from everyone involved, just what Monica also said here. If we look at the traditional cards, okay, I'm just going to bifurcate it segment-wise. India had about 874 million debit cards, but active cards are only 100 million. Because the 874 million debit cards included a large chunk, about 70% of RuPay, which are largely not used at POS. At the credit card segment, we are only at 60 million cards, which includes active cards of 30 million. Now, in terms of numbers, I'll just give some statistics here. Overall digital payments in India, both wholesale and retail, was $22 trillion in FY20. Now, this includes 80% of RTGS, which is largely corporate. Over and above this, you have check clearing of roughly $1 trillion in FY20. Now, checks have been steadily declining from 1.35 trillion in FY11. This check payment, if you ask me, is a huge opportunity to convert to digital payments since they are already under the tax net. But one nuance here is the PDC feature. If that can be replicated on some digital payment mode, then that would help hasten the transition from check to digital. So retail payment, as part of the overall digital retail payments that I mentioned earlier, is a very small part, about 5% of overall, that is $1.1 trillion. And that too, despite the sharp growth in the last few years. Now, to put it in context, India's GDP is $2.8 trillion. Now, out of this $1.1 trillion, UPI, which is fairly new, is already at 25% of the retail. IMPS is about 30%, and cards are another 20%. So UPI has clearly changed the way retail payments happen in India due to ease of transaction and convenience over a mobile phone. But all said and done, cash is still king in retail transaction. 70% of all retail transactions take place in cash, basically, one may say in the parallel economy. Over the last few years, retail digitization has accelerated. Two key macro events that have facilitated digitization, demonetization in 2016 and the pandemic in 2020. I think last 1 year has definitely been a tremendous year for digital payments, retail payments. We saw a very deep adoption in the SME space. A lot of small merchants and businesses started using digital payments for the first time. So on the consumer side, a lot of enabling factors, e-commerce driving online adoption and digital payment, acceptance infrastructure, including QR code, payment infrastructure, including proliferation of smartphone and cheap wireless data, thanks to Jio. On the merchant side, arguably, digitization of merchants and formalization of merchants go in tandem. And GST, mind you, has played an important role in formalization. In a way, increasing digitization of consumer is driving merchants to accept digital payments by way of QR-based and UPI. So net-net, where we are currently poised is higher digitization would lead to higher formalization, which would in turn lead to higher financial inclusion by democratization of lending.
Right. Great points and some great numbers shared, Ritu. Thanks, Monica, as well. So Monica, we had spoken, I think about almost a year ago, right? About FinTech in general, where we had hosted you and Mandar. A lot of discussion then was on payments. So what has changed, in the last 1 year in the payments industry?
That's a great question. Actually, a lot and maybe not a lot. So a couple of things that last year we were very bullish about was about obviously UPI, and there were a lot of milestones that UPI was supposed to hit, which did happen, which was expectedly so. And UPI is riding on the back of a lot of great events coming together to create this serendipity that we find is leading to not only large numbers, but also larger adoption. And COVID has only actually helped accelerate that momentum that UPI needed in order to get past the behavior of relying on cashbacks and incentives to actually becoming a need-based payment method. Second is, of course, that we had talked about the Jio Reliance deal, and The Reliance deal, I come back to the old days, and I've been reading a lot about Reliance also because of the stock market. Reliance is in the long game. It's not in the short-term version of the game. So when you think about all the global players and what they are doing in different parts of the world, rather than just thinking about the Indian landscape, we just maybe spend a couple of seconds to think about, say, Brazil or Africa, or even in parts of Europe. The big tech players are being booted in certain countries because of various government actions. And of course, there is a lot of strategic moves in order to isolate and help curb what they are doing. Versus in India and in emerging countries, there is a huge proliferation to make sure that they become centric and really intrinsic to our growth. And that is being led by, in our case, with the government of India, with the UPI and other revolutions that are taking place. So I think this is probably going to grow. We've seen fintech or at the back of a lot of Chinese investors now change hands with a lot of US investors coming in, which is a huge thing that we did not anticipate. After COVID happened and after India's strategic decision, political or otherwise, we can always debate about it. It was a policy decision and the ban of the Chinese apps. This has actually led to a huge influx of American money, and which has actually led now to the third wave, which is what is going to happen to all those huge companies which have now erupted in India, including the unicorns, 14 of them just this year. So question becomes, are they going to take the SPAC route? Are they going to go IPO? What is going to happen? And now we've just heard about the Paytm IPO, which is still not confirmed. It's only still news until they file their red herring prospectus. But these are a couple of the things that we wouldn't have anticipated the pace at which this has happened, but it's got probably accelerated by many months because of the COVID scenario. Second is the loss, I would say, of the whole ecosystem and the reliance that we've had on WhatsApp. Everybody assumed that WhatsApp Pay would be very big. I say that as a loss because Ritu also mentioned the 100 to 500 million growth that we wanted to see in Indian digital payment users was largely riding on the back of WhatsApp as an everyday use app, and literally the first port of call, whether it is a morning or it is night, and how we use the app. That has not happened, and that's a blip. And third would be, in our particular instance, is that while COVID happened, a lot has been said about it in terms of how users have been able to survive. I still feel that the policy measures that the government could have taken, including tax and taxation as well as incentivization, not associated with cashbacks, but making sure that customers understood the whole digital journey, has probably been lacking. So I come back to my favorite point, which is digital literacy, which we had spoken about last time as well. This was one time that we needed to accelerate that so that consumers' habits stick. I still feel that we have time to be able to make good of that opportunity.
Right. So Ritu, we referred to the report you had authored at the start. Can you just walk us through this report? What are some of the key sort of contents and points that you've covered in this report?
Yeah, sure, Srivatsa. When I started the report, I was under the impression that digital payments would lead to lending. Partly also because most of the payment players, fintechs, were looking to acquire customers via the payment route and hope to monetize via financial products. However, I have realized now that mere ease of transaction would not prompt people or the next cohort of users to switch to digital payments. The possibility of having access to low cost, fast, cash flow based and easy availability of loans is what would prompt the next cohort of users to switch to digital payments. That is, lending is important, but not just for payment companies, but also for the borrowers. Now, in this backdrop, our report discusses the journey and outlook of digital payments in India in a concise yet comprehensive manner. Starting from how the passing of the IT Act 2000 made electronic transactions valid in a court of law. We discussed the various regulatory initiatives undertaken to facilitate digital payments. For example, interoperability has been the cornerstone of payment systems in India. We discussed the ecosystem. With the entry of the third-party apps, there is a battle of sorts between the banks and the fintech. However, this has led to an increase in the user base of digital payments and has not adversely affected the banks as such. We also cover a critical analysis of the draft data protection bill. We discuss key concerns and suggest some recommendations. Concerns related to cybersecurity, data privacy, predatory digital lending apps, etc. As an example, I'll just discuss one concern. Waiver of MDR on UPI has adversely impacted resources available for players to invest to upgrade their systems to keep up with the growing scale. Consequently, transaction failure rates have jumped up from less than 2 banks with a transaction decline rate of under 3% before June 2020 to over 10 banks reporting failure rates greater than 3%. So investment in technical upgrade at the back end is the need of the hour. We also discuss future trends. On the regulatory side, account aggregator, PCR, which is Public Credit Registry, OCEN, as well as how digitization is going to accelerate both on the consumers and merchant side with new use cases on UPI, contactless methods of transit, offline payments, or new product variants such as buy now, pay later. So our report, NetNet, is a must read for anyone who's interested in knowing about the digital payments in India.
Monica, there have been two key developments, right, in the last year. One is the new umbrella entity framework, and the other one is the capping of volume limits at 30% for UPI. How do you look at these two decisions?
So regarding the NUE, I was quite surprised by the list of the applicants, and like they say, and it's a very unparliamentary language to use, so I shall not. But very unlikely participants coming together. And if you heard some of the backroom and back channel conversations that were happening, everybody knew what was happening, but obviously nobody would admit. So we did manage to corner a few people who I remember in one of the conversations I asked, like, what made you think that this would be a good idea? And that's when we, I think most people are grappling with that, including the people in the industry itself. And that's where I think we are at. There's a huge amount of confusion, as well as the entire, I would say, framework that has come out, because there's very little in the public domain, which is the whole problem, because what we are seeing outside is not what is happening internally. I'm sure the RBI is probably formulating strategies in order to be able to de-risk this whole honeypot, which is the NPCI, simply because of the reliance on one single company. And that should never happen, specifically for such a huge company, huge country such as India. Having said that, I think the problem is that when a lot of players come together, typically there will always be a little bit of noise until it becomes music. So I think that is what is going to happen, and the likely participants who win are going to win at the back of a lot of great experience in doing multiple things right, but in their own separate verticals. So how this entire symphony comes together is the question that all of us are trying to grapple with. Also, what is not very clear is how the competition to NPCI would happen. So Ritu spoke about interoperability. I think India takes a lot of pride in that, and so does the world, that interoperability. So a customer should not have to suffer based on closed loops or closed walled gardens that exist. And the RBI has always had a very inclusive approach to such systems. So question will become, how do we make sure that this kind of competition does not just undercut on the monetization aspects of payments, but actually provides value to consumers. So lots of questions. Then on the share,
30%, yeah.
Yes, on the 30%. This is one thing that has been debated in Twitter a lot. And I know that there are a lot of conflicting views on it. Everybody's talked about various things. I'm not sure that this is going to have such a huge ramification, what people are thinking, simply because right now it's about 85 to 90%, between three players, with the top two players being 80%. This is unsustainable, because as new players come in, there has to be space which is made for them, which is not to say that we should become socialistic and, literally give up competition competition. I am not of that opinion either. But this will naturally come down to the level, and that's what we are seeing with Google Pay as well, which is losing ground. But it's not that it's losing ground because others are not coming in. It's losing ground to known people, known competitors, which was likely to happen. However, for me, the major problem is going to be, and that's what I've been thinking as well, which is the guidelines that NPCI will have to release in order to make sure that the customer experience is not marred. Because if a customer loses trust in a digital transaction once, then I feel that the whole onboarding experience would have been lost, and the whole activation journey has actually been lost because of bad experience that we provided them, which should not happen. So somewhere until the volumes stabilize themselves and more players start coming in, which is the hope, because right now, as Ritu pointed out, the reports also seem to suggest that it's the fintechs against the banks, which is a very interesting proposition for a proposition which is really powered by the banks. So you can see the whole, I would say, confusion there. So that's what is going to happen. So I think in a year's time, you would probably notice this to become a complete non-issue.
Right. Great points, Monica. So Ritu, related question to you, right? So we already had NPCI. Now with the NUE framework, we're just trying to replicate what NPCI is doing. So is this essentially competition or just duplication that is probably unnecessary?
I think that's a great question, Srivatsa. It's very interesting to me that RBI is inviting application for a license that would compete with a quasi-regulator, right? NPCI is a quasi-regulator. So with respect to NUE, there are three key factors. One is de-risking, second is spurring innovation, and third is interoperability. So far, as we have mentioned, we have 100 million digital payment users. We need to make digital payments mass-based. I do think that competition, as well as the NUE participants, the broad groups that have come together, they give me enough reason to believe that NUE will foster greater innovation. Now, what has NPCI done so far? So far, NPCI has, over the last decade, build the key retail payment railroads, including the IMPS, on which the hugely successful UPI is based. Besides that, NPCI has also developed the national financial switch. ATM transactions no longer run on Visa, MasterCard. NPCI has developed RuPay, Bharat Bill Payment System, etc., etc. However, NFS, RuPay, BBPS, etc. are all platforms where NPCI could drive adoption through banks or through RBI or government mandate. Yeah, UPI adoption was different. As I think Monica also mentioned in the first part, it requires consumer adoption and private sector participation. So fintech companies played an important role. So UPI is a shining example of public-private partnership. And I think NUE seems to be inspired by this concept. 6 broad consortiums have shown interest. These are rather pretty strong consortiums that bring together the best of the private sector. We have banks, we have payment aggregator, card network, key consumer internet giants, telecom players, large corporate houses, and between them, they have significant capital, customer reach, brand and trust, understanding of the space, and they are key players to be able to anchor initial use case. So to take one of the example, okay, of one NUE, leading private sector banks, ICICI and Axis, largest online and offline payment aggregator, BillDesk and Pine, network, card network, Visa, leading consumer e-commerce player, Amazon. Bear with me, I'll give you one more example. Largest conglomerate, Tata, leading private sector banks, HDFC Bank and Kotak, leading online payment aggregator, PayU, leading telecom player, Airtel, leading e-commerce player, Flipkart, leading financial inclusion player, NABARD. So you see, it's a pretty formidable lineup And I think this can come up with some innovation, definitely. From RBI's perspective, this whole NUE concept has been, as Monica said, to de-risk the fast-growing digital payment ecosystem, where bulk of the settlement is dependent on NPCI, as well as to promote innovation to drive digital payment and financial inclusion. So basically to ensure that there is no monopoly and concentration of risk in the hands of NPCI. Now, emergence of NUE will lead to competition in the retail payment space for the development of newer, innovative and efficient payment solutions and alternative payment infrastructure to include the hitherto excluded geographies and societal cross-sections. Now, how interoperability would be interwoven across products and across these systems is going to be challenging, and it is yet to be seen. Also, Indians are very price sensitive, as we can see from the success of the cashbacks and massive growth of the zero MDR UPI. Though the NUE network, the NUE framework, it allows for an innovative setup and solutions, it remains to be seen if an NUE can be really profitable or successful given the competition by NPCI, because NPCI is a not-for-profit, it is under Section 25. So it will be interesting to see how this space develops and evolves. And just to add to to what Monica said on the cap. So for example, there's an interesting point that given the 30% cap by NPCI on third-party apps on UPI transactions, WhatsApp Pay, WhatsApp has a user base of 400 million users. WhatsApp Pay may not be able to grow its user base as one would expect. So will a newly licensed NUE come up with its own set of regulations and relax the cap on UPI transactions for third-party apps? Now, that is what that's what remains to be seen.
Right. Very interesting points, Ritu. So the next question is around data protection, right? So the Personal Data Protection Bill of 2019, how is it going to impact the payment space? So Monica, if you could answer first, and Ritu, I'll come to you for your views on this as well.
So I haven't really seen the data protection bill in terms of its implications, and I'll tell you the reason why, because it's still being debated, and some of the implications were actually quite damning, but at the same time, these were being debated highly and were being pushed back, at least in the know-how what we did know at that point in time. Having said that, I think the larger scheme seems to be, and the larger intention is, of course, that users should be in control of their own data, which is going to be accelerated by associated frameworks that will come into play. And I feel that the policy can be as effective as the education and therefore the frameworks that will enable this to happen, along with compliance of the players involved. So data protection all over the world, including GDPR, has become fairly successful in being able to do that only because of the fines that have been imposed. So I am trying to find out what this would mean essentially for businesses that don't comply. We are very lax, and this is not to be very, celebrate about ourselves, but we are generally very lax about giving out information, etc. So the privacy bill, if at all, when debated in Parliament, is actually going to give people some much needed education on why it's important, and then how companies actually not only understand it but implement it is what is going to be the litmus test for me. So I'll wait with bated breath on some more details before I can actually have a more informed opinion.
Right, Ritu, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so there are two key aspects with respect to the bill, which I'm going to talk about today. One is the consent-based approach, and second is the data localization. So we are in the age of information where issues related to data monetization and privacy are going to be very important. There is a looming risk of possible misuse of consumer data in the future. So the key objective of PDP is to balance the fundamental right of the individual to data privacy and autonomy, as well as the need to foster a data-driven, free and fair digital economy. If you look at other countries, so US has taken a market-centric approach with light or no regulations, allowing innovators to grow rapidly. Europe has taken a more activist approach and shifted the burden for privacy to the security providers. China, under cyber sovereignty, has sought greater state control. So the draft personal data protection bill is balanced to EU GDPR, but gives the Indian government more leeway than EU. I'll just talk about the consent framework a bit. There is a consent framework to ensure that the consent is free, informed, clear, specific, and capable of being withdrawn. And the concept of layered privacy notices has been introduced. The data fiduciary, which is to whom we submit the data, shall not make the provision of any good or services or the quality thereof conditional or on consent to processing of any personal data not necessary for the purpose. Also, sensitive personal data, which includes financial data, can be processed only with the explicit consent of the data principle, that's of people. Now, coming to the next key point here, data localization and data nationalization is a very pertinent subject within the bill. Given the presence of foreign players in digital payments such as Google Pay, Amazon Pay, WhatsApp Pay, and card networks, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, localization of data is a key development. While India may be a poor country in terms of per capita income, it is rich in data. And there is a strong argument that the data must be mined within India for the country's benefit to help government form better domestic policies for its citizens. Data localization is also essential for national security. Localization of data is needed as once the data is transferred to foreign jurisdiction, Indian authorities may not have access to that data even for statutory purposes. So in 2018, RBI had introduced the data localization norms, which mandated data localization requirements on all information pertaining to payment systems, including complete transaction data to be kept in India. Under the proposed bill now, it is proposed that personal data determined to be critical would be as defined by the government, will be processed only in India. Other types of sensitive personal data, which is non-critical, will require at least one serving copy in India. In a first such action, so even though data localization norm was introduced in 2018 itself, the adherence has not been 100%. So in a first such action, RBI has barred recently, we all must be aware, American Express and Diners Club from onboarding new credit cards in India from May 1st, citing non-compliance of data localization norms. So under the bill also, the government can require any private business to share valuable non-personal data, such as aggregate mobility data collected by apps like Google Maps or Uber or Swiggy or any other such data, or anonymized data with the government to better deliver services or to develop evidence-based policies. So, in net, the personal data protection bill is a very crucial bill about how things will pan out in the future with respect to data security.
Right. So, Ritu, you had written recently, right? I think in December, about how the account aggregator framework can be critical for the growth of MSME lending. So, can you just explain that in a bit more detail?
Sure. Yes, account aggregator framework along with the public credit registry and OCEN can play a transformative role in MSME lending. Now, we are all aware MSME plays a very important role in the economy and employment, but they struggle for credit from formal institutions, resulting in a very large financing gap. Less than 20% of MSMEs have access to formal credit amid an estimated MSME demand of about $1 trillion. Now, the challenge with lending to MSME space for the banks historically has been the difficulty in being able to assess credit worthiness and high OPEX, including the cost of collection, due to which MSMEs end up paying very high rates of interest on loans as they borrow from informal sources. The AA, PCR, and OCEN framework can help solve part of the puzzle for lending to self-employed informal segment and help plug the information gaps, which would give a fillip to MSME lending. Now, what is account aggregator? RBI has established a legal framework for a class of regulated data fiduciary entities, like data which data fiduciary, meaning entities who shall keep the data with themselves, called account aggregators. Consumers can selectively share and even revoke data once shared. Currently, using AA handles, borrowers can consent to share officially verified asset-based data such as bank accounts, deposits, mutual funds, insurance policies, pension funds with lenders that will be incorporated in the onboarding, underwriting, and monitoring process. The biggest challenge for an issuer or for a bank remains income assessment. So AA would help share businesses' operational data in real time to lenders. Bank account data, GST business flows, or payment history could serve as a collateral to get cash flow based loans. Data would come directly from the source, tamper proof at a very low cost and in a real time. This would bring down the cost and burden of verifying the data. Notably, AA are data blind, so AA cannot read or resell consumer data. AA would democratize lending, and banks would be comfortable to lending to NTBs as well, as they would be getting the continuous data. So open access to data would lower switching costs for customers and generally foster competition and financial inclusion. There is another contour to this, which I just touch upon briefly, is the OCAN framework. OCAN is a free digital public good. OCAN is designed to enable many types of loan service providers or LSPs offering diverse species of credit products. Anyone can become an LSP by adopting the OCAN APIs. E-commerce companies such as Amazon, Flipkart, Ola, or food delivery platforms like Swiggy, Make My Trip, or Oyo, Khatabook or Pine for the merchants acquired by it. So there are almost 30 customer-facing entities across segments of tax and filing, payment gateways, agri-tech companies, kirana tech, health, and wellness, among others, which are looking to become loan service providers and adopt this protocol. Finally, I would just like to say that for India to become a $5 trillion economy, lending needs to be done at a mass scale so both businesses and individuals can grow. India's private debt to GDP ratio is about 51%, is amongst the lowest in the globe, amongst its global peers, and we need to increase private debt. Similarly, the tax to GDP ratio for India is also among the lowest, and somewhere both these ratios are correlated.
Right. So just for our viewers, OCAN is Open Credit Enablement Network, and NTB is new to banking, right? So just some jargon that we use in financial services a lot. So moving on, Monica, we've spoken extensively about UPI. So what are some of the newer use cases that you see for UPI?
I see the use cases that exist for UPI to be working more seamlessly. That is one, because there's a definite and urgent need for investment in infrastructure. Second is that I think Ritu has spoken about the Ocean framework. With UPI, there is a definite possibility of various, I would say, tags to be built in within the whole framework itself to become available for various kinds of payments as well, which I'm hoping will happen over a period of time. But the most interesting part for me over the next few months is going to be the adoption of the recurring payments mandate. So as you would have known, the card networks had got this as well, but there have been some serious amount of delays on their side, which led to a serious rap by the regulator and all the issues that have happened with UPI. When consumers adopt for this mandate to be provided on their account, I think this is going to lead to that not only the subscriptions based payments, which is going to take a big leap, but also for UPI to actually become embedded in the entire journey of financial wellness for a consumer. So that becomes imperative. And third is that we've seen a lot of adoption of transit. So I feel that UPI probably has a little bit of way to go on making transit solutions a little bit more accessible. Now, transit as it exists here is very different from transit frameworks anywhere else in the world. Specifically, as you know, we have our circles, and then those are bidded for, and then technologies, while interoperable, really don't offer. So NPCI is coming up with its own transit card. I feel that UPI, once enabled to be able to do, for example, an auto reload, etc., would be definitely valuable. And last but not the least, we've seen a lot of the flows that Ritu had earlier mentioned, like checks, etc., by increasing some of the limits and making this UPI kind of frameworks which already exist, but making it a little bit more business friendly, maybe for some corporate solutions that can be built on top of UPI, like real-time fast payment networks. That would be essentially great for our side of the business, because a lot of the flows that are currently happening via the systems would then have a much easier interface to work with. And last but not the least, digital lending has been spoken about a lot. By doing a basic overdraft on your account, which is very much possible within what we are doing, and I'm sure there are a lot of companies who are actually evaluating this. UPI can definitely come up with something which is going to be majorly acceptable to all of us as consumers. But the one piece that I think we may not have spoken about is the offline UPI use case, which is for when your internet doesn't work. And that might be essential. So I know that there are a couple of companies, and including one which actually had tried an offline UPI transaction, which won't work very well. So I think the offline environment and the ability to therefore be able to go to that second layer of India that we really need to is where I think UPI should be able to focus on now.
Right. So follow-on question on that, Monica. So do you actually see concepts like UPI, RuPay being internationalized and some of these networks actually being replicated in other countries?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. VocaLink was some of the inspiration behind UPI, and because VocaLink was UK's first fast payment network, and it continues to actually be the beacon of light for a lot of these kind of frameworks that exist. UPI, not only for its extreme success story, but also for the kind of infrastructure that they have built, which is very well tied with the digital identity, which we mustn't forget in the financial services equation, is actually becoming very, I would say, is becoming attractive to emerging economies such as ours, but in other parts of the world where there isn't such a system, first of all. And second, the success of UPI has also spawned interest in terms of how we can cut the reliance on foreign players and have a system which is ingenuous, but at the same time offers the ability for private partnerships to help increase the base of the ecosystem. If we see this from the point of view of not just the platform, which is the technology, but also the partnerships that have been enabled. Actually, UPI gives the best example of how private public together can actually create something of great value. So whether it is Vietnam, whether it is Thailand, in fact, Thailand and Singapore just did the first cross-border transaction right now on a real-time fast payments network. So I really think that this is already something that's taken off, and I'm sure if an NPCI representative would be asked the same question, they would tell you that they are spending some time in answering queries. So India, this is not only India's big achievement, this is something which is really a made in India product, which has become very famous and at the same time is leading to a lot of revolutions elsewhere. And as far as RuPay is concerned, I think that RuPay has already gone international. There have been some very big execs hiring for the internationalization of RuPay. So the question is going to be that what will this lead to and what kind of customers are they going after? Because competing with the giants outside, and especially in the interchange regulated markets, is going to be difficult. So probably the internationalization and the GTM is going to be focused on emerging markets, which is pretty similar to India. But I'm almost certain that at the back of a foundation which is very strong, we should be able to see RuPay cards being used internationally as well. And right now, Ritu has brought this very good statistic on RuPay cards in circulation. But Interestingly, the RuPay cards in activation is also rising, which is I'm sure is a big worry for the card networks, because this is not something that they would have anticipated. And RuPay is being given out as a card of preference by a lot of the private sector as well as public sector banks.
Right. That's indeed great news if when it happens. So Ritu, there's a much broader discussion in terms of digital self-reliance, right? People want countries to have their own app stores. We're talking about digital currencies and so on, right? Uh, will these ideas actually help or hinder the growth of digital payments?
Thanks, Srivatsa. That's a really good question. See, following the Chinese incursion in Indian territory, government has banned top Chinese apps, making room for Indian developers to create their alternatives. Now, India is the largest internet market outside the USA, since China has not given entry to big tech. So while we must be vigilant about misuse of monopoly by the big tech, but we have not taken, and we must not take the Chinese approach. In the name of self-reliance, we should not restrict other apps, as it may slow down our pace of digitization. If we look at the success of UPI, the cash burn that has been actually funded by foreign investors. If we look at, say, Indian players also, such as PhonePe or Paytm, they have big foreign investors. So in a way, the cashbacks and aggressive marketing that has made UPI popular has been funded by foreign investors. So we must not close down, but we can make our own apps, but at the same time, we must not follow the Chinese way. What we need to do is to strengthen our data security, data privacy, and data localization norms, so that would prevent misuse of data. Now, one classic example of misuse by monopoly is the Google enforcing a 30% autocratic commission on in-app stores of digital goods from its Play Store, which would be implemented from April 2022. So that's why India is now coming up with a plan for an Atmanirbhar app store in order to break the duopoly of Google Play Store and Apple App Store. Various Indian apps have been up in arms against Google for what they have said, which is a complete sort of an autocratic announcement. So how the government will place this Atmanirbhar app store is that the government may ask Google and Apple to pre-install Indian App Store in all phones sold in India in near future. India may also attempt to distribute its App Store on Progressive Web App and get users to access it via any browser. So as long as we do not restrict foreign apps, unless they misuse monopoly, our own versions will help digitization, no doubt. As regards the digital currency, RBI is exploring a legally safe, secure form of central bank digital currency, CBDC, with utmost precaution to come out with a digital currency in India. It is a work in progress at RBI, and prior to the launch of such a currency, the RBI will ensure that necessary technological capability is created. CBDC can help advance financial digitization and financial inclusion. This will further help reduce the cash in circulation in the system. CBDC can greatly reduce the issuance and transaction costs of the monetary currency in circulation, such as printing, transportation, storage, and maintenance. CBDC can also use existing digital marketing channels to achieve universal distribution and to strengthen the digital ecosystem. So net-net, yes, coming up with our own versions will help digitization, as long as we do not bar the international versions that are going on, unless there has been some sort of an exploitation.
Right. So this has been a very interesting question, and I'll come to my last question, which I'll ask both of you. Monica, probably I'll start with you on this one. So if you look at a, say, 5-10 year horizon, which I know is fairly long, right? But how do you see the entire digital payments landscape evolve in that time? And then what other regulations do we need in place to make sure that, we get to that state?
So that's a great question. I think the first couple of things that come to my mind is that the government has been doing a very good job as the primary innovator in the country. And and of course, there are always going to be upsides and downsides of that. However, while we are growing organically very well, and of course there has been a lot of interest, but we are a huge country. We need to grow faster, and that acceleration has to be fastened right now, because right now is where the dent needs to be made in the next 2 to 3 years. Because as more and more people have become accustomed to getting online for their education purposes, there is no better way to actually introduce them to digital, and that becoming a force of habit. So that force of habit creation is where I think we should be putting a lot of emphasis on. And second is the merchant digitization, which Ritu had brought up earlier. We've talked about the 60 million merchants, we've talked about the Kirana stores, we've talked about the SMBs, we've talked about lending and capital, but the supply chain has to be digitized. And that when it starts happening, we will see a lot of these flows that currently are going in cash becoming digitized, and therefore leading to this large revolution whereby more people come into the formal chain. At the same time, they are able to reap the dividends of being in the formal economy, which we are not able to give them right now. But just giving them a QR code doesn't really help them. Giving them a QR code with the added benefits of, say, being able to give them standing capital is a very different proposition. And I think we should be probably trying to extend the digitization value chain instead of looking at the peripherals, which we are doing right now. And third, which is probably the most important, is the policy incentives and the participation of private think tanks, as well as, of course, individuals or maybe even organizations working with the government to try and see what had come out during the demonetization times about a larger long-term strategy to make digital mainstream. And a lot of great ideas had come out at that point in time, and also examples from other countries, including South Korea. And while we've again celebrated UPI, I think it's time to go back to the drawing board and really ask the question, have we really solved for what we wanted to happen in demonetization? No matter what the success is, no matter what the failure is, that is immaterial. What were some of those highlighted pointers that would have led to that digitization that we were looking for, and why it didn't happen? Because a lot of the reports that have come through have not still been implemented. And the last is a payment regulator. We do need a payments regulator, independent, almost innovative to the point that they work hand in hand with fintechs. And last is financial literacy. Sorry, I kept saying last 2-3 times, but there are so many points to cover. Financial literacy is extremely important, but digital financial literacy is something else. We need more people to become wealthy. We need people to take care of their finances, but we don't need people losing money because of fraud. Not even one person should lose money because of phishing, fraud, or any other related mechanism, and we are all responsible for
that. Ritu, your thoughts?
So I'll just, since I believe this is the last question, I'll just try to sort of summarize where we should be in the next 5 to 10 years. So some of the key trends which are at nascent stage right now, but will surely pick up momentum in the next 2 to 3 years, as already mentioned by Monica: mass digitization of small businesses, proliferation of super apps, extension of credit to mass segment through BNPL or other BNPL, buy now, pay later, or other forms of product innovation, AA-PCR OCEN framework to drive lending to MSME, coming up of a digital currency, CBDC, internationalization of UPI, RuPay, Atmanirbhar App Store, blockchain technology exploration, and much more. Some of the above can perhaps drive sachetization of lending, thereby making them accessible to the relatively unserved market spaces. So I'll just elaborate on 2 to 3 of these trends. We expect mass digitization of small businesses, not just grocery or commerce stores, but also services like plumbers, salons, etc. Fintech players are targeting the small traders and the tier 2, tier 3 cities with digital payment services and credit schemes. Mass digitization of retail would be facilitated by contactless, offline, as well as credit on UPI, which would likely accelerate digitization in historically cash-based areas such as low-ticket items of everyday purchases and small merchants. We could also see super apps as a major disruption in digital payments. For example, China's WeChat, which started out as a messaging app, expanded into payments, cabs, shopping, food ordering to become a super app. Payment super apps in India have already started. They've acquired a large customer base, and some of them will choose to expand their offerings further. Tech-savvy banks such as HDFC Bank are expected to create their own ecosystem, health, auto, merchant, in this battle for customer ownership and customer monetization. Buy now, pay later or similar product innovation is likely to expand credit culture in a way similar as UPI has expanded digital payment. There are only 30 million active credit cards in India, and BNPL is expected to provide access to customer segments below the income thresholds for credit cards, with a stronger focus on self-employed segments, thereby help extend the credit culture instead of competing with credit card. For merchants, this is a great way to drive up the value of transactions. BNPL is a great way to drive up the value of transactions or reduce the failure rate of transactions or make the checkout process simpler and convenient. Now, in terms of regulation, RBI really needs to strike a balance between convenience and security. There will be more discussion on and around MDR with increasing requirement for investment in payment infrastructure. There should be surely a regulation of online predatory loan apps in the form of a national level regulatory umbrella body. We need to strengthen the AA framework by including utility bills, GST, income tax returns, credit card bills, loan repayment history, etc. Banks should submit loan repayment history to credit bureaus on a more real-time basis, so to make the information more relevant for credit assessment under the account aggregator framework. As Monica said, digital literacy must be embedded with financial literacy. Not only that, all government benefits and schemes in insurance, pension, provident fund must be integrated on a common national level platform. And lastly, I would say video KYC should be made simpler, strengthen the central KYC framework, and we must explore the use of automation, blockchain, AI, ML to carry out the KYC process.
Right. Fascinating wrap, Ritu. Thanks for that. I think this has been a really, really great episode. We've covered a lot. Payments is a very interesting area and an ever-evolving area, and we've covered regulation, innovation. So thanks to both Ritu and Monica for joining us on this podcast. Do tune in to more Bharat Varta podcast. Till we meet again, stay safe and Jai Hind.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharat Varta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.